Welcome to all of you who are joining us for this important webinar, for this conversation that is so urgently needed as we continue on in this time of a divided country, as we continue to look at ways for greater justice and how can the church be a part of speaking about this. I'm delighted. My name is Chuck Robertson. I'm the canon to the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, looking at ministry beyond. And I am absolutely delighted today to be able to welcome you to this very special conversation, co-sponsored by the CEEP Network and by the Office of Government Relations, which is found right there in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill, right next to the Supreme Court and behind the Capitol building. And I am delighted also to ask my colleague to give his greetings and to serve as moderator for this important panel. I, like the rest of you, have much that we will be learning today, and I am so glad that you could join us for this important dialogue. Alan?
Thank you, Canon Chuck. I appreciate it. And thank you to our panelists who are with us today. We will speak for 45 minutes or so together and have time for question and answers at the end. So please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to submit your questions. We are awaiting an ASL interpreter to join us, and hopefully we'll get that established as soon as we can. Also need to confirm if the captions are operating as well. That feature is supposed to be enabled on Zoom, and hopefully that is the case. If someone is seeing those, please let us know in the chat. But with that, really excited to hear from our expert panel this afternoon. Each of you have a different take on why defending voting rights is important now, and what we can do. This work, it's nonpartisan and is based in protecting every person's right to cast their vote according to the values that have informed decisions. Sister Quincy Howard is leading federal level efforts on voting rights with an organization called Faithful Democracy. Georgia State Senator Kim Jackson does amazing work as a priest with Church of the Common Ground in Atlanta, and now brings her faith experience into an elected position in Georgia. And Dara Baldwin directs federal policy at the Center for Disability Rights, focusing on voting rights for the deaf community and people with disabilities. Tension on elections, understandably increases during an election season, which we have just recently been through. But in moments like right now, the chance to enhance and protect Americans' right to vote often occurs between election seasons. And recently, we've been seeing coordinated efforts to restrict access to voting across the country. Presiding Bishop Curry speaks of the importance of exercising our right to vote as a means of positively impacting our common life together. He explains that voting is a sign of looking out for our neighbor, something that is quite central to our faith as Christians. I was fortunate to lead the Episcopal Church's Vote Faithfully engagement through the 2020 election season, building upon what we had done ecumenically in 2018 for the midterms and 2016 before that. And I'm really pleased to have been just a small part of what became an election with the highest voter turnout in over 100 years. Not only that, during a pandemic, and it was surrounded by anxiety over election security. But despite these concerns, numerous government and private entities observed that this is one of the most secure elections in history. All of this was possible because of the diligent post office employees, the state level election workers, including many first-time poll workers, something I signed up to do for the first time as well. So as we celebrate the high levels of engagement in last year's election, we must also acknowledge and confront the barriers that many people face when trying to cast their vote. And we must maintain that momentum to increase in participation in future elections. So enough for me. I want to turn to our panelists, and we'll begin with you, Sister Quincy, asking a fairly broad question. Can you tell us a bit about the need to protect voting rights right now, and give an overview of what's happening in Congress to address this, including the For the People Act?
Sure, I'd love to, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me today, and to be joined by this panel. It's amazing. So I wanted to start out giving just a little context as the sort of first speaker in the group, and talk about the fact that for more than 50 years, most of the people on this call, including myself, have sort of taken for granted that voting is a right and that it shouldn't be too difficult to do. But that attitude is really relatively recent in our nation's history. In practice, voting had always been treated as an exclusive privilege of select citizens until the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the VRA, in 1965, which was really a pivotal shift, as I'm sure you all are aware. And unfortunately, more recently, as Alan alluded to, we have been seeing some serious backsliding that is more akin to our prior periods in our history. It started sort of with the Shelby ruling in 2013 really started that backsliding. And then in the 2020 election cycle, it got turbocharged with the false narrative that we have all heard about election fraud. And so with the weakened VRA, states are now using that narrative to take really aggressive steps to erect barriers to voting. Many states are. And so I would say that the fight in states can be thought of today as a fight not to move backwards. And State Senator Jackson will be talking more about that. But the federal fight is really, I'm pleased to say, one that wants to continue that trend that we saw started with the Voting Rights Act to make voting safer, more accessible for all voters. So when it comes to federal voting reforms, I like to think of them in sort of two approaches or types of reforms. The first one is the across the board approach. So that is something like setting baseline minimum standards to make sure that voters can count on a certain level of access no matter where they live. And the second group or type of voting reforms are really responding to the needs of specific communities, like my colleague Dara's work. These are often historically disenfranchised populations, and these reforms can sometimes look like restoring their right to vote that had been taken away from them unjustly, or it can also be strengthening protections and providing remedies for barriers that we know impact their ability to vote. So I'll talk about two key pieces of federal reform bills that are currently being considered by Congress. They take different approaches, but the two of these bills combined would really preclude the deliberate attempts that we're seeing by some states right now to make it harder to vote. The first bill is the For the People Act, sometimes called HR 1 or S1. And the second bill is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So the For the People Act is a comprehensive democracy reform bill that would make it easier to vote in federal elections, without a doubt. The added bonus to this bill is that it would also end partisan gerrymandering. It would also overhaul federal campaign finance laws. It would increase safeguards against foreign interference in our elections, and it would strengthen government ethics rules. Like when I say comprehensive, I mean this is the ACA of democracy reforms. And I'll talk right now about the voting and election reforms specifically. So the voting reforms in this bill generally fall into that across the board approach that I mentioned. The bill enacts sort of a set of best practices for elections and voting. It centralizes them, it standardizes them so that if you're a federal voter, you can expect a level of access to the ballot, regardless of what state you live in. Certain options must be available for all voters. Options like no excuse, vote by mail, or online voter registration, expectations like 15 days of early voting, and many, many other provisions that I'm not going to go into too much detail about. So the For the People Act does include some reforms also that fall into that second type of voting reforms I mentioned. Some examples of this would be restoring voting rights to the formerly incarcerated citizens that have had them taken away due to state laws, or banning reckless purges of voter registration rolls that we know disproportionately impact communities of color. So the For the People Act really makes a fundamental paradigm shift explicit, and that's related to voting in federal elections. It shifts the burden from the individual voter to the state administrator, which is huge. It also declares voting as a fundamental right and aims to make the exercise of that right accessible to everyone. And it reforms the administration of elections in a way that lowers barriers and takes known suppression tactics totally off of the table. So it really tackles some of the better known structural weaknesses and the vulnerabilities in our democratic systems, which many states are currently trying to exploit. And we know that reforms to remove barriers to voting do tend to be more beneficial for voters of color and disenfranchised communities. However, I should say that the For the People Act doesn't solve the problem of racial discrimination in democratic systems. It includes a lot, as you heard, but it doesn't restore the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, the VRA, to protect voters from discriminatory practices. Instead, what the For the People Act does is it includes clear and strong language that supports legislation that would do that. So if you remember, the Shelby ruling that gutted the VRA required a modern update to the pre-clearance formula. And it's the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is a separate piece of legislation that is really the legislative mechanism that would do that. And it's on a bit of a longer track right now than the For the People Act. We expect it to be introduced in sometime over the summer. So as we're thinking about the For the People Act and the need to pass it and advocating for it, it's so important that we think of these bills as two companion bills. And part of our advocacy of For the People Act really needs to ensure that Congress also makes good on its commitment to restore the Voting Rights Act by also passing that second bill when it comes to the floor.
Great, thank you, Quincy. I appreciate that summary. I know that my video is frozen, but I'm working on that technical difficulty. Kim, to turn to you, our office talks about encouraging Episcopalians to engage more in our public life, and you took or have taken public engagement quite seriously running for office in Georgia. And as many in our audience know, I think Georgia has been in the news from the 2020 election to recent state legislation on voting rights, making it an interesting case study, so to speak, for why defending voting rights is so important. So in no particular order, I'd love to hear from you a bit about the recent voting challenges in Georgia, the experience of the 2020 election, and hear about your experience running for office there.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me. It's always good to be with you all. Yes, I am serving as a state senator and do so as an expression and a part of what it means to be a person of faith and what it means to be a faith leader. I've also been engaged in public policy long before I ever stepped under what we call the Gold Dome by advocating and being a voice for the people here in Georgia for many years. Just a few things about voting here in Georgia. So in 2020, we had two elections. We had a primary in May that was, I guess it was delayed until June. And that's where if you saw anything in the newspaper and you saw long lines, hours long lines, 4 hours, 5 hour long, 6 hour long lines, that happened in our June primary. Part of that was because of the pandemic, of course, and part of that was because voting rights have been systematically, dismantled in many ways here in Georgia. Polling stations were closed. Poll watchers or polling people who serve in the polls weren't there. Now, some of that was in large part because of the pandemic. In Georgia, I don't know if this is true across the United States, but in Georgia, the average age of a poll worker is 70 years old. And so when you have a pandemic that was particularly deadly to people who were 65 years and older, suddenly our workforce, we lost, a third of our workforce to fears around the pandemic. And so that contributed, I think, a great deal to massive long lines here in Georgia for the primary, the June primary. But then here's the thing that I think people often miss is that in November, the election that is most contested now here in Georgia, the average line in Georgia across the state was 5 minutes. And it's because people took advantage of the ability to vote by mail or to vote by dropping your ballot off in the ballot drop box. And so we saw this incredible support and swell for having that option of being able to stay at home, fill out your ballot, and put it in a mailbox or put it in a drop box to be able to vote that way. And that brought our lines down substantially. We also in Georgia, we got some new machines. And that was a whole nother part of the problem, was just we had new poll workers, brand new poll workers who haven't figured out how to use new machines. So all of that, I think, compounded into some sense of unsurety about the integrity of our election. But if those of you who followed, you know, we counted our votes not one time, not two times, but three times. I like to say we counted in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, and in the name of the Holy Ghost. So we know that our election in November was a free and fair election, and that the votes were thoroughly counted. But there has been this ongoing narrative that things were not as the media has said. And I like to try to, I've worked really hard in the last 4 months to try to understand my colleagues who feel this way. And the best analogy that I can come up with after having spoken and talked to my colleagues a lot about this issue, the best analogy that I can come up with is once upon a time, I threw my back out. And when I threw my back out, I experienced excruciating pain in my leg. And so I went to the doctor and I told them that my leg was hurting. And he said to me, let's do some, scans. And they scanned and they did x-rays, and he showed me, no, it's your back that's a problem. And I said to him, no, I know for sure that my leg hurts. I know that without a doubt, that the pain is in my leg. So stop looking at my back. The pain is in my leg. And I think that those of what we call now the big lie, but those people who believe the big lie, it's because they feel in their bones that something was wrong. And it doesn't matter that the scans indicate that no, the pain is not where you say it is. They feel it in their bones. And so that's what we're dealing with and wrestling with here in Georgia, is trying to respond to people who feel a particular way about elections that's not true, but that's how they feel. And so consequently, we got 98 pages of election reform here in Georgia, 98 pages that I might add, I received on my desk 30 minutes before I had to vote on it. And those 98 pages are a comprehensive shift in how we vote. And I think the biggest shift is that now the state can kind of take over local elections boards whenever they feel like it. The language in the bill is because of basically not doing their job. There's no real metrics for it. And that's really an attack on largely metro areas here in Atlanta that are overwhelmingly Democratic. And so we're going to see state officials come in and take over those elections. And many of you might be wondering, why does that matter? Well, it matters because it's on the local level that we understand the needs for where polling places should be. I'll tell you now, North Atlanta is really different than South Atlanta. And so if you only put polling places in churches in South Atlanta, then you're going to miss some folks who go to mosque, right? Like there's some real local nuances that are important. So having someone from the state come in and intervene just isn't going to be helpful, right? So there are a number of provisions in that law, and we don't have to go into that create some problems. But I think the biggest issue here is that we've got to do the work to now, particularly here in Georgia, to help ensure people that voting is still a safe thing, that it's still free and fair and accurate, and that we will count our votes well, and that we are willing to help each other. And I think this is a role that the church must play, is that we will help one another get to the polls and vote legally regardless of whether other barriers may be in the way. That, I think, must be our commitment moving forward, is that we will help people overcome the obstacles that are now new and get people to the polls.
Thank you for that, Kim. I really appreciate you reviewing that and sharing your experience there. I mean, to have the personal engagement, as well as the perspective that I think many of us share, of sort of looking at it from afar, is just it's so valuable. So thank you for that. Dara, I want to turn to you now, and you work on expanding voting rights for the deaf community, for people with disabilities, a critical piece of, our electorate, of our communities. What current barriers are there for these communities, for these people to get to the ballot box, including in the past election, and what solutions are out there to address them?
Sure. So peace and blessings, everyone. Power to the people. All power to the people. So I'm Dara Baldwin, Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights. We are a CIL, which is a Center for Independent Living, which are non-residential centers where people with disabilities go for services, these kinds of services. How do I vote? How do I get to register to vote? We provide those, as well as advocacy, as well as fellowship. My CIL is located in Rochester, New York, right? A very centered civil rights place. But I live and work in Washington, D.C. And I must say this, D.C. statehood, D.C. statehood, D.C. statehood, right? You're talking about voting, right? All right, taxation without representation right here in D.C. I don't have any elected officials who vote in Congress. So voting is very important to us, right? And to my work. So I'm just going to go back a little bit just to give some history. And thank you, Sister Quincy, for your conversation. And you're correct. A lot of people think that, right? Like that voting is something that's supposed to happen to people immediately. We all know, right, the racist nature of this country. But many people don't talk about the ableist nature of this country, right? And the intersection of that, of being a Black disabled person trying to cast a vote in this country. We come from the perspective of disability justice, which centers Black and brown folks, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. Which means that we take on that intersectionality. We take on the fact that disabled people are many different things and have what I've coined multi-marginalizations in their lives. So just to go back a little bit, yes, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was done. It did not include disabled people. People with disabilities did not get the civil right to vote in this country until July 26, 1990. That's only 30 years ago. People's mouths are open. Correct. That's in the ADA. Before that, they did not have the right to vote. Even if you were Black in the civil rights, and didn't have the right to vote. Everyone loves to celebrate the 19th Amendment. Women got the right to vote. That is not true. White women got the right to vote. And that's how you need to celebrate that, what happened there. Women of color, Black, BIPOC, Native American women, and women with disabilities did not get the right to vote till July 26, 1990. And so that says a lot, right? And people look and they say, what do you mean? And why? I said, that is when people in this country got a civil right. Disabled people got a civil right. Why did that happen? In 1876, you had the first, what is called ugly laws that came from San Francisco, California. And what that said was that if you had a disability, you're not to be in public spaces. So therefore started, right, institution like keeping people in your home. So if you had a baby, you can tell when a child is born with like Down syndrome or cerebral palsy disability. They kept them in the house. They weren't allowed to have public education. They weren't allowed to be involved in any public events. Specific, right? Voting. No way, you're not voting. You're not a person, right? Then you had the New Deal with FDR, right, which is also a racist and ableist policies. People don't want to discuss that, but right, FDR created redlining with New Deal. People want to talk about that side of it, but they don't, right? And when he created those social services, those weren't for everyone. Those were for white people, not for the whole entire community, not for the whole entire country. And what he did for disabled folks is he took that and said, he took the 1876 ugly laws and said, now we will put these people in institutions. And he started institutionalizing people. And even though he had a disability himself, which he denied for many, many years, he did this to other disabled folks. And for all of those years, right, till 1990 is when we start getting people out of institutions. It's ironic that the Olmstead v. Lois Curtis case is from Georgia. Lois Curtis is from Georgia. And her case connected the two, the ADA, 1990, and in 1995, her case to say that people with disabilities should not be institutionalized. If they wish to get out, let them out. And when they're out, they should receive all civil rights like everyone else in this country. So that's just some history so you know about disabilities, which also goes to show you that when people write policies and laws, they don't think of disabled people because they weren't supposed to be here. They're not supposed to be voting. So that's why you see these laws. And so we have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. You do have the Rehab Act, Section 504, which means if an entity receives federal funds, they have to provide that civil right for people with disabilities. And you have HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, which should all combine help people with disabilities vote, but it doesn't. A couple of things. One is get the access in and out of any voting site, any polling site. Senator Jackson, you spoke very well about standing online and being online for 4 or 5 hours. People with disabilities can't do that, especially if they take medication, right? They're out there in the sun, they need water. So there are some states who say, okay, if you have a disability, you can go to the front of the line, and they'll do that. There are some states where they allow people to curbside vote, right? You can drive up in your car and they'll bring the ballot out to you. There are some states, right? We all know that voting is state by state. There are some states that do allow people to mail in their ballots, right? But for people with disabilities, let me start from the beginning. There's not a state in the country that offers a registration form in Braille. So our people who are blind or low vision have to have someone else fill out their registration form. And in HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, where a lot of that is in there, it says you are allowed to cast a private individual ballot, and you are allowed to have a private individual registration. So our people who are blind and low vision don't get that. So that's why when people are all like mail-in ballot is the greatest thing in the world, it is not for disabled people. Vote by mail is good for a lot of the community, but not for all of the community. Our Native American, indigenous people will tell you the same thing because of their lack of addresses and how their mailing is set up. Oregon, we fight with Oregon all the time. Oh, this is great. Everybody's voting by mail, and that's not true for our people. Another issue about vote by mail is it's those, when you get the form, people old enough, you SAT kind of, that bubble you fill in. So if you have no dexterity, and I'm holding up my hand for those of you who can't see, and hold a pen like I'm holding, that's dexterity, which a lot of disabled people do not have. Their hands shake, they can't hold a pen. And so if you come outside of the bubble, just a little bit, and they scan it, it says, oh, we don't know, did she vote for Tom or did she vote for Jerry? And they say, okay, sorry, it's negated. And there's not a lot of systems that are able to call back and say, hey, your vote didn't count, you need to do this again. That surely is not happening, right? What's happening in Georgia, they don't want that to happen. So they're not going to do that. So a lot of our people can't vote by mail. We also have what's called guardianship, where people with disabilities lose their power of their life. Someone comes in and says, I'm going to be Jane's guardian. I'm going to be John's guardian. And that guardian is in charge of all of their life, not just their financial life, not just paying their rent or giving them spending money. They are in charge of the fact they say whether Jane or John can vote. Some people, and we've had cases and we have people, that's the SIL, they'll come to the Center for Independent Living and say, my mom won't let me vote. Or I want to vote for Joe Biden and she wants me to vote for Trump, so she's not going to let me go vote. Okay, so vote by mail. That means that person has to trust that parent or that guardian to give them their ballot and to vote. And many of our people don't get their ballots. Whereas if they went out and got, right, they can't stop them when they're inside that ballot booth. You can't do it. Again, access to the ballot. Many ballots in this country are either in churches or centers of faith or schools. And unfortunately, many of our churches and schools are not accessible. Our schools, 90% of our schools in this country are not accessible for our children with disabilities. They can't go to school. They go to school to 3rd grade, and then the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade is on the 2nd level, and there's no elevator to take them there. That's our children in school. So then therefore, if you try, right, they can't get inside the buildings. So that's where the ballot center is for the county, the city, wherever they live. So our people who have physical disabilities can't get in. People say, oh, it's only one step. They cannot get in. So we have issues and concerns about that. We've done we do every year, every election, there's analysis and assessments of ballot boxes, of where people vote when people go and vote, and even dropping off your ballot. Now in the new Georgia law, right, they said the ballot is going to be on the inside. You have to go inside the building now to drop. Are those buildings accessible for our people to get inside? Sometimes what will happen is that front door is accessible from 9 to 5. And then they say, oh, you have to go in the back door to get in to do this. And there's steps and everything. So that's not accessible, right? So how is that going to work for our people who do want to vote by mail and drop off their ballot? So these are the problems. We, again, people who are blind, low vision, they don't get to fill out their own ballot. Someone else fills it out for them. And real quick, you know, Senator Jackson, you mentioned the poll workers. Many of our poll workers in this country are not trained on what disabilities are or how to talk to our people, how to be kind, right, and etiquette. And what do you say to people? You don't call people crippled, and we don't use the word handicap anymore. That went out in 1980s, right? It's accessible. Is this accessible? Is it an accessible parking? Is this an accessible document? Right, we don't ask them, are you smart enough to vote? Well, we've had that, yes, because if you have a developmental disability and you can't really, right, or if you have a stutter or things like that. We have no ASL interpreters at any sites in the country for our deaf, and not just deaf people use ASL. There are a lot of people with developmental disabilities who use ASL as their form of communications because they either have a speech impediment or they speak slow, and so they use ASL. And so this is not afforded to them. So those are the issues. How do you fix that? Well, through our great coalition work. That's how I know Sister Quincy, right, and Alan, and through both the For the People Act has a lot of language in there to strengthen what's already done. And actually what's happening is we create these great laws, and even in HR 1, and we discuss this, we're not funding it. We are not funding this. And we as a country, we have to have the political will to say we will fund these things. We will give money to churches so that they can retrofix their buildings and get ramps so that people can come in. But we will give money to schools so that they can do that. Or we will move the voting sites. We don't see that. And even in HR 1, everyone, it's a very good bill, but that piece is missing, is funding all of these things that need to be funded at the state level, specifically for disabilities, because that's what they say to us. We don't have the money to do this, right? So we want you to, but we want to support those bills. The same with John Lewis Act, right? In reference to that, it comes to communications and how you deliver information out. You're supposed to follow Title II. Many people don't follow Title II, which is communications. How is information sent out to the community about voting? Please, you know, join your CILs, your Centers for Independent Living. There's one by law in every state, but there's always many, like in New York, there's over 30 of them. In Georgia, they've got great CILs around there. And the CILs really will do this work and help out. They will come and test. They will say, okay, let's see where you're going to set up voting. Also, it's not just a voting center, it's the pathway of travel. Are you near a transit system where people, because most people with disabilities don't drive, they use public transportation, or they have some type of a van system that drops them off, right? Is that accessible to get in and out right from there? Or, you know, we've had many times construction's going on and they're digging up the street before the ballot, and then we're like, why are y'all doing that the week of election? Okay, hold on, we got to figure out another way to get our people to the ballot. And as Sister Jackson said, the faith-based community can help out with that, because usually, you know, there's a church on the corner, there's a mosque on the corner, and they can say, oh, hold on, we're here to help out, we're going to make sure you get in, we're going to make sure that these things are done for the community. And then finally, there are what's called the protection and advocacy programs, which are the civil rights lawyers for people with disabilities. NDRN, the National Disability Rights Network, I used to work there. You can go to their website. I'll put this in the chat box. The same thing for the CILs. We have a map. You can find your state, and your CILs are there. But the PNAs are the civil rights lawyers for people with disabilities, and they will help to make sure that the people in your community, you know their rights. We do that at the CILs as well. But those lawyers on election day are poll watchers, right? And they're there to say, no, you have to help this person with a disability. They also, the PNAs, do these assessments of the election sites and the poll sites throughout the states every 2 or 3 years, and they tell the governors and they tell your state legislators, you need to make this better. And so, you know, the faith-based community can help out with that and say, listen, our brothers and sisters, our family who are disabled can't vote. We just need to do these things. Let's help out and do those things. And then finally, what you can also do is something else that happened in Georgia in 2019, when they tried to pull out and say, oh, we're closing these polling sites because they're not ADA accessible. And we were like, okay, wait a minute. The polling sites haven't been ADA accessible for 20 years, and you're going to use us as your voter suppression. No, sorry, it's 2018 when Stacey Abrams was running. That's right. And we were like, no. So you can stand up and say, don't do that. Do not try to use the fact that you have been suppressing disabled votes for all these years as your excuse for not opening these polls, as your excuse for not giving this right to other people. That is what happens in our community, and that is what disability justice works on. Disability justice has 10 principles. The first is intersectionality, and the last is collective liberation. That is collective liberation. You do not allow someone else to come in and say, we're gonna do this to that group, and it's okay. We don't pit each other's plights against each other. And so that's where we can all help out, especially around voting, because it should be, and it must be, a right for every person in this country to cast that vote.
Thank you, Dara, for speaking to so much of the detail of the needs, the experiences of the deaf community, of people with disabilities, and the barriers to voting. And I just, what I hear in that are, it's on the one hand daunting, but I think on the other hand, you listed different ways to engage. There are all sorts of examples, problems that each of us can be a part of overcoming. It's not just a legislative answer. It's also, Episcopal churches across the country often serve as polling locations. We should be striving for accessibility across the board. But when we think about, okay, if we're serving as a polling site, are we prepared to actually do that for everybody? That's a question that I think Episcopal churches can ask themselves who are interested in doing that. So I really appreciate you highlighting those details.
And Alan, I'll just add, thank you for that. I'll just add, because a lot of people don't know this either. And in the ADA, when the ADA was written, and I've gotten this from history, I was helped out, but I wasn't there then. My grandmother had a disability, so she helped out with the ADA. Faith-based organizations asked to be exempt from the ADA. So that's why you see a lot of churches that are not accessible. Now, it's one thing to go above and beyond the law, which is what a lot, especially Black churches, right? Like I'm an AME and Baptist. My grandmother's side, I'm AME, and my grandfather's side, I'm Baptist. And we have ASL interpreters. We've had ASL interpreters in services since I was in 8th grade. We always had, right? Because I had a whole community of deaf people in New Jersey. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. Right here in Washington, D.C., we have Gallaudet University. We have deaf students. The AME churches here have always had ASL interpreters for those students to come to church. So a lot of churches will use that as their crutch, so say, that we don't have to be ADA accessible. And I'm not saying everyone, and I'll just tell you, it was a right-wing conservative remember who was in Congress in 1990, Jesse Helms, and all of right. Okay, let's remember who was there, who asked for this. But we have seen many faith-based groups who say, no, we don't care, we're gonna go, all right. There are a lot of synagogues, a lot of mosques. I work with a lot of Muslim communities who have said, we don't care, Dara, we're going to do this. So please, I implore you to talk to your other faith-based organizations who are using that out, because that's what they will say. We're exempt from the ADA. We don't have to do that. That is a problem for us in our work.
Yeah, the point is figuring out solutions to these problems. And if that's above and beyond the law, then that's the way, to go and to be more inclusive, and do more than even what's required by law, but it includes the advocacy piece as well. And before we open to Q&A and folks in attendance, please do remember you can submit questions to the Q&A box or to the chat. I want to hear, I'd like to hear from you, Quincy, and you, Kim. What are ways that people can get involved with your work? So, specific to Georgia, and then specific to Faithful Democracy. And Kim, if you want to go ahead and get started, that'd be great.
Sure. I often direct people to fairfight.com, which is Stacey Abrams. At this point, I feel like everybody in the world knows her name. But if you don't, she was an African-American woman who ran for governor here in Georgia in 2018, lost that election in large part because of voter suppression. And so she launched this organization, Fair Fight, that has been waging a fair fight across the South and southern states in particular, to try to make sure that we have access to the ballot, to fight against voter purges, to fight back and beat back these bills that we've seen show up across the United States. So Fair Fight is one of the places that I would urge folks to check out if they're looking to engage here in Georgia. And I'll just go ahead and say, please go ahead and book your plane tickets, or like train, or however it is that you can get here in 2022. We need your help. It's going to be all hands on deck to make sure that folks can actually access the ballot. So if you are free to do that, come on down. We'll find a place for you to stay and put folks to work.
Great, thank you. Quincy?
Georgia just does not get a respite, does it? Our prayers are with you all in your righteous fight, that's for sure. So Faithful Democracy, we are kind of an organic coalition of faith-based organizations. It's multi-faith, and really we exist to enable people of faith and organizations with faith-based missions to engage on issues of democracy, particularly federal reforms to democracy. Because I recognize, and we recognize, that democracy is rarely the first issue that faith-based organizations are focused on. However, we also know that people of faith care deeply about it. And we also recognize that it impacts every one of the other issues that we deal with, whether it's hunger, whether it is economic inequality, whether it is healthcare for all of these things are directly impacted by how our democracy functions. So if you're with a faith-based organization, an institution, congregation, a group, all are welcome. I'll put a link to our partners pamphlet, which explains how we can support your advocacy with resources and information. Or if you really don't have the bandwidth to engage on that level, how you can support ours if you're not able to fully engage on the issue. So the easiest example would be endorsing our voters covenant, which is on our website, and which is faithfuldemocracy.us. It's a one-time action that essentially gets your group publicly listed as a supporter of the mission. You can subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter, which we try to, it only comes out once every couple of weeks, but it's a full update on where our campaign is, what we're doing, how you can engage. So that's another way that you can get engaged. And then also, if you are with an organization, or if you are an active advocate that is very passionate about democracy reforms, you can sign up to our listserv, our emails, and get sort of real-time information about meetings that we're having, about breaking news on the federal legislative front, and what the state of play is in Congress, and sort of policy, that if you want to get in the weeds on the policy also. And just to give a little bit of context, what we're really focused on as a coalition that we all agree we want to see move forward on a federal level is the For the People Act, which is obvious, the baseline access, then the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to stem the racial discrimination, and then also DC statehood, which Dara mentioned, which is one of those sort of targeted responses to a historically disenfranchised community in which I live as well. So please call your senator on my behalf, because I unfortunately don't have that ability.
Great, thank you for that, Quincy. And I'll add just a couple of things from the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations as well. And I'll put these in the chat. So we have our general voting and advocacy resources from our office that are available in our advocacy resources page here, including our Vote Faithfully election toolkit that's gone through a couple of revisions in the last several election cycles, and that we developed ecumenically with a couple of other faith-based partners. We also have action alerts that you all can sign up for, and one in particular on the For the People Act. Let me type this into the chat. And so that is to write your members of Congress directly about that bill. And we have a similar one as well in support of statehood for DC. And I hope that you all are able to take action on that. These action alerts are geared toward our Episcopal audience. So the draft messages to Congress, would identify yourself as an Episcopalian, but I hope that those who who are in the audience who aren't Episcopalian would be able to edit that and send the message as well if you're interested in using our system. We continually work on voting rights from different angles at the federal level, are grateful for the partnership with Faithful Democracy in particular, and hope that you all are able to engage with that directly. And for those in Georgia, those who are outside of Georgia that can support the work that's going on there in terms of defending access to voting, and then of course with Dara and her work, really hope you all can engage. So with that, I want to turn to a couple of questions, moderate a few questions from our audience. Excuse me, and the first one, and I think any of you all can take this, but Keegan says that they're interested in hearing the opinion on whether or not making Election Day a federal holiday would increase voter turnout. Is that something positive to look forward to or advocate for?
I am a firm believer that anytime we can lower a barrier, that it's helpful. And so for those who work for, and also I think that sometimes the federal government can help lead the way. So the federal government makes it a election day a holiday, then states may follow in line, and so on and so on. And so, yeah, I am a strong advocate of making it a holiday, both on federal level and on state level. And then those for people who on corporate levels, right? Like if you own Delta, you don't have to, you can just make it a holiday, right? You don't have to have anybody's permission. So I would urge us to really begin to look at, even on our county level, the city next to me has made Election Day a holiday for their city employees, and it helps. It's a step.
Sure, and that points to that, and anyone can go above and beyond in a sense. So I know that the Episcopal Church has now changed that as well, I believe, or at least we did this past election cycle for being a holiday for us to go vote. Another question, along those lines, Kim and others maybe can respond to this as well. We've seen sort of corporate pressure come into play in Georgia in particular, but the person saying that are there any thoughts about what citizen consumers can do to pressure them, given Stacey Abrams' caution about boycotting?
Yeah, as it pertains specifically to Georgia, it's a complicated place. We are not of the same mind on that issue in terms of different leaders across the state. So Dara, I'll point out to the AME bishop. The AME bishop in Georgia, Reginald Jackson, no relation, is a strong advocate of boycotting the major corporations here in Georgia. And as noted, Stacey Abrams is not. I'm actually also kind of on that side of not advocating for boycotting because it hurts Georgians. It hurts the regular people much more than it does the 56 colleagues that I have who sit up in the state Senate with me. So I would urge caution around boycotting, but I do think that we can certainly reach out to these corporations and strongly urge them to get involved, and to get involved much sooner, and to really call. I mean, the real push now has been to ask them to withhold campaign contributions to senators and representatives who fought for these bills. And I think that's kind of threads the needle quite well, is to urge them to not make campaign contributions, to not set up independent expenditures for those who have really been pushing for voter suppression.
Right, and this is Dara. Bishop Jackson was my reverend growing up, St. Matthew's AME in Orange, New Jersey. That's where he comes from. As you can see, I'm active in the AME, right? And then I'm a Delta, so my soror, right? Vashti Torley is right. Murphy is another bishop. But I will say this, many of us did a lot of boycotting, right? When states like South Carolina, Mississippi, Tennessee would not get rid of the Confederate flag, right? And like Delta Sigma Theta, there's 200,000 of us. When we have a conference, we have over 75,000 women who come on a regular basis. We refuse to have conferences in those states. So I think those kinds of boycotting, like the MLB leaving Georgia, does say something, so it could be a one-time thing. And that's what we said, no, if you change this, we'll come, right? Like, it's not like we're never going to come again. But that is a part of boycott. And I hear that, when they say people are going to, it does harm the workers, but it also empowers workers, right? Let me tell you, I'm older. I don't look this old. People always say this to me, but I'm a seasoned person. Some of my first activism was South Africa. And it was us. There was a line drawn in the sand that you could do this through the policy. And, you know, people like, if they were going to have human rights, they would have been human a long time ago, and they weren't. It was not until we told them, and we told Coca-Cola and Nike and all those companies, if you don't divest from South Africa, Black people will stop buying your product. And that is when South Africa started to dismantle apartheid. Unfortunately, we live in a capitalist society. And so a lot of us believe, you know, and I'm with my Bishop Jackson, that we need to start boycotting these things. And there are different ways to boycott, right? There are different ways. And also joining in social media, right? My young people are hammering them on their Twitter account. When Coca-Cola writes something about, oh, we're so racial justice, they go, you don't know what racial justice is because you did this in Georgia, right? Just hit their Facebook. You want to have a Facebook live conversation around equity? Yeah, we don't think so. And they, right? There are other ways to protest companies and boycott companies now, because we're in a different area. You could also tell people, just don't buy Coca-Cola products in your state, right? Or say, keep buying them in Georgia because Georgians need jobs, whatever. But where states where there's people who have money and things are doing well, right? Like Washington, D.C., we're not a state, but D.C. is doing pretty good. We can boycott Coca-Cola until you see you later, right? So there are other ways, or you can do a letter writing campaign, right? Every week we're sending 10,000 letters to you all because Delta, you said you support Georgia's bill. So there are other ways to do this, and we have to engage in that in other ways. We have to let our voices be known, and that there are other ways to do this, and tell them what you're doing is wrong.
I would just say public shaming is very effective. I think the fear of a boycott can be as effective as actually having a boycott, and social media, as Adara pointed out, is an amazing tool when it comes to getting that message out and amplifying the fear of it going viral.
So there are a couple of questions, and I'm attempt to summarize them around essentially around misinformation on the election. And so some of the there's a question that approaches it from, are there resources that succinctly summarize, you know, what these restrictive voting bills are doing, or what the bills in Congress propose? Is there a way to either approach the media or public opinion in terms of increasing accountability for truthful reporting and for truthful information consumption as well? I'm wondering if any of you all have perspective on that. Quincy.
I would love to just shout out some of the other provisions in HR 1, including what is formally known as the Disclose Act, which has been rolled up into this comprehensive bill. And it has very strong measures of requiring disclosure for donors above, for example, $10,000, as well as where the commercials, the campaign commercials that you see, which so many of them are just vitriol, you will know who is funding those commercials and where they're coming from. So there's a measure of transparency that actually the Supreme Court pointed to in the Citizens United ruling, saying all of what we are saying about money in politics is contingent upon having a transparent system. So that to me is a key reforms in the For the People Act that are needed to help us push back on these false narratives that we can't even discern where they're coming from anymore.
Great, thanks for that insight into that bill. And I'll also add a bit to this question as well. The Episcopal Church has a resource on misinformation, on how to identify it, combat it, and you know, acknowledge that we are all susceptible to it. It's not something that has a partisan bend. It's something that we each can, that can cause each of us to stumble. And so we hope that resource, we'll continue to promote it, continue to expand it. It looks at misinformation from a number of angles, not just around elections, but hopefully that will be something helpful for you all as well. I have lost the question in the chat, my next question. So Cassandra is asking, are there any thoughts on how to get more churches engaged? Some church leaders believe in the importance, or ministers believe in the importance of this type of engagement, but may have different reservations around losing members, or the disunity that may come from, you know, engaging in political conversation. So how do we get more churches engaged in this work?
I think it starts with simply asking for churches to get involved. And it starts, sometimes it starts out with a really small outreach. So this last session, we needed to get more polling places online because of social distancing requirements, right? So we couldn't have as many machines packed into one place as before. And so I just began to reach out to local pastors and say, hey, like, do you mind opening up your doors to be a polling location? And overwhelmingly, people said yes. And people were just like, wait, I didn't know, I don't know how to do it. Like, who do I, and they were just waiting to be asked. Right. And I think that was a really helpful, just kind of toe in the water, because opening your building up for a polling station isn't, yeah, particularly controversial. But then I do think that continuing the conversations, and some of it can just be around basic civics. So what I've discovered over the course of running for election and now serving is that people of no fault of their own really don't understand basic civics. I'm a senator, but I don't live in Washington, right? So people don't understand that there are different kinds of senators or different kinds of representatives. And I think that churches can be a place where we can do that kind of basic training, and it's completely nonpartisan. It's apolitical, or maybe it's political, but it's not partisan, for sure. And it just starts doing the education in a way that I think can be really kind of less combative and easygoing, just to start answering those questions. And then, the Episcopal, the network does have real resources that you can use in your congregations to continue the conversation as well. But I just want to encourage people to not be afraid and to really understand that we can talk about voting in a nonpartisan way. And if we begin to model that, in some ways we get to take that back from the people who have weaponized it and suggested that voting is partisan, because it isn't. It doesn't have to be, especially if we really take it on, and try to address those issues and that kind of education in our congregations.
And this is, I totally agree. And because I work right with 501(c)(3)s and 504, we're 504(c), and people are like, and I am a registered federal lobbyist. People are like, you are? And I'm like, yes, I have to be, because I'm talking to Congress. So that, and people don't understand the difference either, right? Like what Senator Jackson is saying, right? I get it all the time. They're like, she's a senator, but I don't see her on the list of 100. I'm like, oh no, she's a state senator, like that, right? So they don't understand it, but they also don't understand the difference between advocacy and lobbying, right? And so, like, when I lobby, and I do it all the time, my advocates will come in before me and say, this is why we need you to make polls accessible, right? I come in behind them and say, you need to vote yes for HR 1, for S1. When I tell a member how to vote, that's lobbying. Right, that's the difference. And then also, I think everything that the senator said, but here's the other thing. You can't just do it one time a year or once every 4 years, right? Voting this conversation of advocacy has to become part of your either monthly, quarterly conversation with the community. That's another part. That is how they can get you, because they'll say, oh, you decided to get involved in voting because of the election, which does look kind of bad to IRS. Just so you know, over the years, the reason they passed that IRS law was because the churches, AME churches specifically, right? But Reverend Martin Luther King, all of those civil rights people came from the faith-based areas, and they said, we got to shut this down. So it is because, right, they're like, oh, this is how we could go after you, right? And just so you know, from I think it's 60 years old now, that IRS, I think they've gotten two organizations that have ever been called out about overusing, right, lobbying. And they were they were doing wrong, and they know they were doing wrong. So it's not something, and that's the other thing I tell people too. I'm like, the IRS can barely keep up with people who are paying taxes, and they surely can't get these $1,400 checks out. They're not worried about y'all right now. So that's another thing. Do not be concerned. That should not be your concern. Your concern is, right, to bring the flock to justice and to equity. And so that should be at the center, but make it part of your strategy for how you interact with the community. And then they really can't say anything to you, because you constantly are doing this. And they say, oh, well, you have a history of doing this.
Mr. Quincy, do you have anything to add to how to bring churches and faith groups into this?
I think what Kim said is so true. It is really a matter of reclaiming the narrative. I think that so many of the values of the faith community can be easily connected to the values, democratic values, quite honestly. Collectively building the new creation, engaging, using agency, having your voice heard as a matter of dignity. All of these are so far beyond partisan concepts that my experience has been that it really takes a conversation to break that open, one conversation to break that open, and people can begin to frame things differently, but they have to be exposed to it.
Sure. That makes sense, and really appreciate y'all's time today and your insight into bringing faith groups into this. From the Episcopal Church's perspective, at least at our level with the Office of Government Relations, we're here positioned, as a resource to the church on getting involved in advocacy. So I hope that those who have these concerns, have these curiosities, can reach out to us and know that we have, an open door to hopefully working with you and engaging your congregation, your conference center, whatever sort of Episcopal entity it may be, engaging you all in this work. And we're looking forward, ahead into the coming months. Dara, you mentioned the importance of keeping this as a year round, and that's part of the reason why we chose now in early April to do a webinar on elections and voting. We didn't do this on this topic in this way during the midst of the election cycle because really the time for action on these items is now. So I'm hoping everyone who's listened feels inspired, feels equipped to take more action and be engaged. We will partner again with CEEP in early May for another webinar on redistricting and gerrymandering. The Episcopal Church was a part of the 2020 census as an official partner with the Census Bureau for getting an accurate count. It's something that I also led last year and had a really great time doing it. This Bureau was just wonderful to work with and, to roll with the punches of the pandemic with them and doing something that really requires a lot of face-to-face interaction that was delayed or altered was a great process. And now sort of the fruits of that will be the data sets that the president and different states will receive this year to begin the apportionment for seats in the House and redistricting within each state. So I've seen a geocivics person in the chat. I think that's Rebecca Theobald, who's out in Colorado, a professor, geographer. She'll be a speaker for that. I really look forward to connecting with that in early May. So thank you again. Thanks to CEEP for partnering with us on this. Quincy, Dara, Kim, thank you so much for your time today. We will have a recording available of this as soon as we can tomorrow. We'll work on accessibility of that recording as well, given the shortcomings of today. And we'll hope to follow up for those who have registered with a resource that contains the links that are in the chat. So with that, I'll close this and again, just thank you all for your time.